When science reaches its end, it's like the snake that bites its own tail. It's looking into impenetrable darkness. It realizes science is never going to tell us the ground of being. It comes full circle back to where it started, which is this resignation and this need for myth. We've come to the end of this mathematical quest. It brought us back to the Platonic cosmology of the soul of the universe being this infinitely dense point in the center, which somehow occupies each point of the encompassing sphere, where the past, present, and future are conserved. They radiate in on these strings of energy to create this holographic illusion. Brian Greene, the famous string theorist, explicitly compared this to Plato's cave allegory.
Oh, wow. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. After even a glancing dip into ancient epics, myths, tragedies, Platonic dialogues, it's pretty clear there is a lot going on beneath the surface. There are layers of intended hidden meanings, layers of possible hidden meanings and interpretations, which makes it quite possible to drive yourself a touch bonkers exploring the depths of these works. But it's a fun kind of bonkers portal to get slurped into, at least for me. And on that note, given the fact that we are diving beneath the surface of two classic works, Euripides' The Bacchae and Plato's Republic, this is not a casual mind melt. This is somewhat of a brain melter. This is fairly esoteric territory. It's going to require you to focus in on some names and archetypes and themes if you really want to grok the gold that's being presented. And for that reason, I've decided to do something a little special with this episode. I've added quite a number of accompanying images and names to help lubricate your entry into this territory, or maybe it's entering you. Either way, not a bad idea to have some lubrication, right? There's also a chart I've got linked in the comments that maps out a bunch of the key connections between these texts. Anyway, that aforementioned mythopoetic gold and that chart are not mine to take credit for, my friends. This is the work of the brilliant Dr. Timothy Owen Desmond. He is a philosopher, professor, author of Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. It is excellent, thought-provoking stuff. Do dive into it and dive into our previous mind melts for more on that. All the links for Tim, his book, and his course, which looks absolutely stellar, by the way, are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on that note, like, subscribe, comment, share, tickle the algorithm in all ways. It does do the channel an assist. Also, do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got hundreds of episodes with truly brilliant beings, and they will never go up here on YouTube. And if you want to not only support these transmissions, but meld minds with me directly along with hundreds of other truly sweet seekers, enter the Wonder Lodge at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server book club. We do live hangs on Zoom. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. I do hope to meld minds with you there. But presently, let's do so with Timothy Owen Desmond. The mystery that is Platonism and the Platonic corpus, in particular, the Republic, where you find, famous allegory of the cave, among so many other things. But one of the things I just wanted to bring up at the beginning is when we look at these texts like the Republic, it looks on the surface like it's a book about the ideal city state, right? And in a sense it is, but then if you look deeper, there's all of these esoteric layers to a point where we are now well over 2,300, 400 years since this book is written. And we still don't fully understand this thing. Like, we still have not fully decoded, like, all of the esoteric geometry and references and things going on in this text. So I thought a fun question to just query you with from the outset is, what do you really think these texts are? Or maybe even just the Republic itself. Like, what do you think the Republic really is?
I think it's a lot of things. I think I would like to read something that Friedrich Nietzsche said about Plato in The Birth of Tragedy out of the Spirit of Music. He says, if tragedy had absorbed into itself all the earlier types of art, the same might also be said in an eccentric sense of the Platonic dialogue, which, a mixture of all extant styles and forms, hovers midway between narrative, lyric, and drama, between prose and poetry, and so has also broken the strict old law of the unity of linguistic form. The Platonic dialogue was, as it were, the barge on which the shipwrecked ancient poetry saved herself with all her children, crowded into a narrow space and timidly submitting to the single pilot Socrates. They now sailed into a new world, which never tired of looking at the fantastic spectacle of this procession.
Wow.
So Nietzsche was saying in Plato's dialogues, all of the previous forms of Greek literature and the tragic and comic plays and Homer especially were combined.
Yeah.
And forced to follow the Socratic method of dialectic, of rational analysis, seeking to break the argument down to the archetypes, the fundamental ideas imprinted on the soul. But in addition to that, or included in that, by including all these other ancient Greek literary forms, it is also a kind of a ritualistic guide. For a careful reader, the mythic subtexts, these literary parallels with Homer and Euripides, is what we'll be talking about, his tragic play, the Bacchae, those were inspired by the mystery religions.
Yeah.
And I'm going to focus on the Orphic mystery religion, which was supposed to open up the eye of your soul to God, or what Plato called the idea of the good, and that would help you overcome the fear of death by helping you realize that you're an eternal soul.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, man. Yeah. You know, it occurred to me when I was making that cave video that, you know, we look at megalithic structures like the pyramids and we just think, wow, we don't really have a clue what leads to something like this. You know, there's tons of theories. Just by me saying that, there's going to be so many people who want to write, it's this, it's that, it's this. We don't know for certain what would lead a culture to do something that is so intensively difficult from not only a physical standpoint, but just so mathematically precise. You know, there's been so much work done on like all of the different geometry it displays and how it like perfectly matches like how the three great pyramids of Giza match the three stars that comprise the belt of Orion or Osiris in the cosmos, how it encodes like the size of the earth, all of these different things, right?
Right.
I really think the Republic is a literary version of something like that, where it's so every single syllable, and this has been proven by the way, that every single syllable was like toiled over and put there for a very specific reason. And like if you really want to go down this rabbit hole, there's this researcher named John Bremer who I mentioned in that video who apparently counted by hand like every single syllable in the Republic,
right,
so that he could show that there was purposeful references being made under the surface to music, to music theory, to geometry, to all of these other things, but in a way where it is never stated in the text. But you get these crazy coincidences that are too impossible to dismiss, where like right on, and I believe this is an actual example, where like right on the perfect octave, like the midway point of the text, it says like the word you find is musicae.
Right.
Like, is the word music or something like that. And also he talks about the divided line, which encodes the golden ratio at the perfect golden ratio dividing point of the entire text. So, so things like this that you're not going to find unless you do these almost like, you know, autistic level deep dives of obsessive, just laboring over the thing. And then when you are rewarded for it like that, I mean, God, like the levels of either just psychosis or synchronicity, or maybe there's no difference between those two things at a certain point, like that you encounter are just insane. And it's there. I mean, the stuff is there. And that's why I wanted to ask you that question of like, what do you think these things are? Because they're just, I completely agree with what you're saying, that they're certainly not just what they appear to be on the surface.
No.
But what's amazing to me is that they are what they are on the surface. Like, they're perfectly coherent on the surface, but they're even more coherent the more time you spend with them in ways that I still can't imagine, because I haven't stumbled across these things organically. I've had people tell me or read about them or whatever. And I just, man, it's like, it's kind of the same feeling I get when I look at Carl Jung's Red Book or something, where I'm just like, is there anyone alive today that could make that single-handedly? And I feel that way, I think, about the Republic, and even to a greater degree.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I love Carl Jung,
Same.
I think everyone's a footnote to Plato, like Whitehead said. Jung's one of the best. Nietzsche's almost on the level of Plato, but he's still a footnote, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think he was aware of what you're saying and had riddles of his own. I think when you get to a certain level of philosophy, like Plato and Nietzsche, I would even put Jung there, you realize the lesson you're trying to teach cannot be taught directly.
Yeah.
And that to help the student or the reader understand what you're saying, you have to force them to solve a riddle. It's part of the process, that it can't be done any other way. It's not just to be fancy or to elude detection by censors who could kill you. It's also just a psychological requirement to situate the concepts in your mind appropriately, and when the spark of insight spontaneously emerges. Like, the words can't do it, but the words, if put in the proper sequence, can prepare your mind to receive the insight by the mercy of the God, if the God so chooses. But these people who have seen it, like Plato, and I believe Nietzsche and Carl Jung, they're experienced enough to lay out the concepts in a way that will help others have the same insight.
Yes.
And I think that's why Plato survives all these millennia, because so many people have kind of had their eye of their soul at least a little bit opened by reading his dialogues. Even if you don't know what's happening, it's some unconscious effect is occurring because he's mastered these archetypal images and the sequences that they need to be in.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, and that you were talking about how he was counting the syllables and correlating the overt dialogues symbolically with the mathematical sequence of the numbered. J.B. Kennedy also wrote a book about that.
Yeah.
The 12-note Pythagorean musical scale. And at the harmonic intervals, like 6/12ths, he'll mention harmony. At the dissonant ones, he'll mention dissonance. So there's that Pythagorean level. And then I believe in the Republic, it's got several mythical subtexts, like the Odyssey. I just was reading a book by, I'll show you. Here it is. The Republic, the Odyssey of Philosophy. So this is, I've just got it. Jacob Howland. He says the Republic has a mythical subtext with the Odyssey. So Socrates is kind of paralleling the actions of Odysseus. This other lady, Eva Braun, not Hitler's girlfriend. She was actually, I believe, a Jewish emigre from Germany, like Leo Strauss. So the music of the Republic, she says that in the Republic, Socrates is paralleling the story of Heracles, who went to the underworld and had to bring up the three-headed dog. What I'm arguing, that no one else has argued, at least explicitly, I think Nietzsche alluded to it secretly in The Birth of Tragedy, is, in my opinion, the primary mythical subtext, the unspoken archetype underlying the surface structure, is Euripides' play, the Bacchae. which is especially comical because in the Republic, tragic and comic plays are banned from the ideal city-state, and Euripides in particular is banned as being an especial fan of, especially fond of tyranny and praising tyrants.
Mm-hmm.
So when what we can do is just go over the kind of what are these parallels, but the beauty of it is it point for point inverts the surface meaning.
This is huge. Like that point right there is huge because so two things. One, going back a little ways, what you're talking about the importance of having the realization for yourself through reading, through study. I mean, I think that one of the reasons people are so almost unconsciously attracted to the whole divided line and cave allegory is because those pieces of symbolism communicate what you just said and so much more, right? Because they imply, like, the divided line. I'll put this up on the screen here. You know, these four types of wisdom that correspond to the parts of this whole cave allegory, where I guess we should just take a sidebar here, and for people that don't know, I'll give the overview. It's a thought experiment. It's not supposed to be real, but Socrates is talking about a hypothetical, a thought experiment in which you have this cave that goes down into the ground, and there's unsuspecting people who are shackled up, and their entire life they've been shackled up facing a wall where they see only shadows. There's a low wall behind the people and a torch by which these shadows are cast. And then there are like these sort of like matrix jail keepers who are moving images such that the shadow is projected. So they'll be moving like the model of a bird or whatever, and then they'll see a bird on the wall. Now the thought experiment continues by, Socrates saying, like, imagine, this person is freed one day. What would happen? Well, they would turn around and they would see the jail keeper and the fire, and they would be immensely confused and uncomfortable. Like, most people think it's like, I escaped the Matrix, yay. But that's not what it is. It's people are freaked out. They want to go back to being shackled. But then he says, now imagine that person is dragged out and they're forced to go to the surface. And they get to the surface and they're just blinded. It's extremely uncomfortable. And finally their eyes start to adjust and they start, making sense of the world around them. And they see animals and trees and all the things that are out in nature. And then eventually they start seeing the night sky and the stars. And eventually until they see like the greatest sight, which is the sun. But then that's not the end of it, because now this person, yes, they've achieved this truer, higher way of seeing reality. But now they have to descend again, and they have to go back down, because this is like the duty of the philosopher that Socrates is implying, to go back down there and tell everyone, hey, this is not reality. Like, you're living in a very lower level slice of reality. You're being completely deceived. But then, of course, in the perfect, type of Socratically intensive way that he thinks about, these people are not excited. Like, just the opposite. They think he's insane, and they all basically form into a violent mob and kill him for disturbing their reality to such an uncomfortable extent. Within that is that point, that you were making, that you've got to make the realizations for yourself. Not only does having someone explain it to you not work, it might make you angry. It might make you emotional. It might make you hate that person. Like, that's the level of power that comes with having experiences that disrupt your reality and then elevate your reality to a new level. But also within that, to your point with the Bacchae, is a key, I forget how to say this correctly, but like a chiasmatic, chiasmos theme of inverting, playing with the idea of like going through a process of ascent and descent. And it's very clear also that the whole Republic is a chiasmos. It's a thing that goes up and down, and it literally ends with another going up and down in the myth of with reincarnation and all of that stuff. So I think you're making a hugely important point that we can't overlook here, that this model of chiasmos, of like going up and down, or the, being able to view the thing forward and backward. I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but it's something to that effect. That's something that Plato is playing with all the time. And we should also say, people love to talk about the censorship part of Republic, like, oh, he thinks art should be banned. There's built-in irony in this statement. Like, he's saying we should ban things, like, like he's railing against Homer in one way directly, and then he goes on to quote Homer constantly later on. And it's not because it's an oversight. Like, there's you have to like think critically about why he would be doing this. And now I think we have some interesting context to discuss how the Bacchae could be yet another example of that kind of a thing.
Yeah, definitely. So what I was thinking about doing was going over the parallels between the Bacchae and the Republic, just the real broad ones. Then I was going to place it in the context of the cave allegory, and
perfect.
And how that has revealed what the current academic physicists say is the situation, which I think adds a whole nother level of intensity to the whole conversation, because Plato's cosmology, which says that these absolute ideas are out specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe, and they radiate this temporal illusion in from there, that's what the string theorists are saying. When they united general relativity and quantum mechanics, out pops Plato's cosmology of the past, the present, and the future being conserved at the outermost sphere of the universe and projected in on these fundamental strings, which was Carl Jung's near-death experience.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about the previous two interviews. Within that context, if we assume that the horizon of the cosmos is the collective unconscious mind, where all of the archetypes are, the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, and the idea of the good is the sum total of all of them, which in the Timaeus would be the universal soul in the central point of the universe and at each point of the encompassing sphere. It's reiterated, this spherical mind of the universe. Then I think that idea of the good, which is kind of an impersonal philosophical abstraction in the cave allegory, becomes personified by the parallel with the Bacchae. And that the Orphic understanding of the god Dionysus is the idea of the good. Is justice personified. They're looking for what is justice in the Republic.
Yes.
In the Bacchae, they call Dionysus justice directly.
Interesting.
And then Cadmus, who's King Pentheus's grandfather, says, too justly has the god dealt with Thebes. So he's like overly just.
Let's take a broad overview, because I'm following you. I'm loving what you're saying. And just to, let me focus in on one point. So you brought up this idea, and for those who haven't seen our previous conversations, you have this idea that we could kind of sum it up as an as above, so below sort of notion of reality, in which the cosmic and the microcosmic individual mirror one another. So in some not just mythopoetic sense, but actually ontological sense, the horizon of the cosmos mirrors the horizon of the individual consciousness, which for us would be the collective unconscious. And in the macro, it's kind of the same thing, reflecting back in on itself. And this is a theme that you see talked about directly in the Timaeus, like the microcosm of the individual, like the individual psyche mirroring the macrocosm. And then, of course, that, echoes throughout Western esotericism and all kinds of mysticism, both Eastern and Western, Hermetic, whatever. It's all over the place.
Right.
Jung, obviously. Okay, so there's that point. And then to the other point, let's kind of introduce the Bacchae, because I'm assuming a lot of people aren't very familiar with it. I unfortunately am not a classicist.
Yeah.
I know the gist of that play, but let's kind of introduce it, place it in context, and talk about what it is.
Okay, sure. And you mentioned you're not a classicist, and neither am I. I
Yeah.
took a class in Greek tragic plays at Georgetown University, and that is where I discovered this parallel. This was back in 2006.
Interesting.
But I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments saying, "Oh, you had this flaw, this flaw, this flaw." And what I even wrote, I did this was my thesis for a Master's of Liberal Studies degree at Georgetown.
Cool.
And in that thesis, I said, I don't speak Greek. There's certainly a lot of nuances I'm going to miss, but for the sake of seeing an overall plot parallel, any general translations should be sufficient to see that.
Yeah.
So I'll just go over the basic story of the Bacchae, which was Euripides' last play. It won him first prize at the Dionysia, the annual festival for the god Dionysus, where they would perform 3 tragic plays and a comedy. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and then Euripides were the 3 famous ones. And Nietzsche says Euripides killed that art form by embracing the Socratic technique of overly rationalizing everything. But then Nietzsche says in section 12 of The Birth of Tragedy, at the end of his life, Euripides realized you can't suppress Dionysus.
Yeah.
Would that you could, but you can't. And then he wrote the Bacchae as his final glorification of the god he had tried to oppress.
Wow.
And then Nietzsche says he committed suicide. He died before it was performed.
Wow.
So he left Athens in 408 BC, and then he died in 406. And then his son brought his last plays back to Athens, and they won him first prize posthumously after he died.
Wow, that's really cool.
So so that's a whole cool thing. So the Bacchae is Dionysus returning to Thebes. And with most of Euripides' plays, he starts with explaining the whole thing. The hero of the play, in this case, it's Dionysus himself. So Dionysus is an actor wearing the face of the god, long flowing blonde hair, young beardless man. And he says that he's returned to Thebes. He traveled from Lydia through the Bactrian fastness, which is out at the easternmost border of the Persian Greek Empire, where they have Hindu and Greek gods. And that's an important point we can bring in when we get back to Nietzsche, because he equates tragic Greek culture with Indian Brahmanic culture. Yeah, there's a whole lot of interesting things in there. So he says, I've returned now to avenge my mother's name. Semele is his mother's name. She had been impregnated by Zeus. And Hera, Zeus's sister bride, always has a chip on her shoulder against the mortal children that Zeus sires, and she tries to kill them. And so there's 2 versions of Hera trying to kill Dionysus. There's the public religious version, which is that it was Semele. I used to always get these names mixed up. So Semele, that's the public version. But the Orphic version is it was Persephone, the daughter of Demeter and Hades. And then in that version, Hera had the Titans rip the baby Dionysus into shreds and then eat him. And then Zeus hit the Titans with a lightning bolt. And humans are partly Titanic and partly Dionysian. And that little particle of Dionysus is our eternal reincarnating soul. That's the Orphic version. And Dionysus is called Zagreus in that version. In the public religious version, Semele is his mother. Hera tricks her into asking Zeus to show her his original form, which is a lightning bolt. And so when he does, he incinerates her. But at the same time, he snatches the baby from her womb and sews him into his own thigh, and then brings him out away from Hera so that she doesn't know. So in the play, Dionysus is standing in front of his mother's tomb, which is still smoldering with the fire of Zeus. And there's ivy from vine ivy leaves covering. And he says, I provided the leaves to cover my mother's tomb. I give thanks to my father, my grandfather Cadmus, for making this tomb. So Cadmus is the founder of Thebes. He's an old man now. He handed down the throne to his grandson, King Pentheus. His mother is Agave. And she said, oh, that was a nonsense story our father made up. Really, Semele got impregnated by a mortal man, and Zeus incinerated her because she said it was Zeus who got her pregnant.
Mm.
And so Dionysus says, I am here to avenge my mother's good name. King Pentheus, believing his mother's lie, doesn't offer me sacrifices. So I've brought my rituals to all these cities where Greek and foreign cultures combine. Here I am, homecomed to Thebes, and they will accept my rites. And then I'll move on and continue to spread my cult. So then the scene is Tiresias, the blind prophet, who's a famous figure in Greek mythology, arriving at the gates of Thebes and saying, open up the gates, tell Cadmus I'm here. Now he's wearing an ivy crown, a wreath of ivy on his head, and he's got a thyrsus, which is a fennel stalk with ivy at the end and sometimes a pine cone. It's the magic wand of Dionysus. That's what they hold. It's part of the cult.
And isn't there speculation that this is where they would hide various, or they would put various, entheogenic plants in that thing, and then that would go into the wine?
I wouldn't doubt it.
Okay.
Especially
I think that's in Brian Murescu's book, The Immortality Key. I believe that's, he outlines a bunch of evidence to that effect.
Yeah. Well, they start tripping out pretty hard.
And so I was going to say before, it's already extremely trippy sounding with,
it's nuts.
Turning into a lightning bolt and incinerating someone. It's just I don't know. Yeah. Continue.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, and then Dionysus says, I drove the women of Thebes mad, only the women, not the men, all of them driven from their shuttle and their loom out to Mount Cithaeron, where they act like my Bacchae. So he's accompanied by the Asian Bacchae, which are his female devotees.
Yeah.
The Bacchantes, also called the Bacchae. That's the play's name, the Bacchae. So the chorus in the tragic plays, they'd have a chorus and they'd have 3 actors and they'd wear masks. Different actors would play different parts. But the Theban women were driven mad by Dionysus, and they're also sometimes called the Maenads. They're also called Bacchae, but Maenads. And old and young, all of the women of Thebes are out on the mountain. So now Tiresias arrives at Thebes, and he's warmly greeted by Cadmus. They're 2 very old men, and they're both wearing ivy on their heads. I'm pointing out these because the same imagery appears in the Republic, at the beginning of the Republic. So they say, oh, my friend, here we are. We're going to dance for the god. It's not just the young. The god wants honor from the old as well. Oh, I feel young and I could frisk, like a newborn deer. And they'll say, we'll use our thyrsi, our thyrsuses as canes, and we'll help each other. And I feel younger already. This is great. And then Cadmus says, uh-oh, Tiresias, you're the guide in most spiritual things, but since I can see, let me tell you, here comes my grandson, Pentheus. He's very angry. And then Pentheus comes on. He says, I've heard our women have been driven mad by some cult. They're out there having drunken orgies on Mount Cithaeron. In his mind, they're naked and they're sneaking off in the bushes and having sex. Mm-hmm. And that, he says, whenever you see wine involved with a festival, no good can come of that. I'll have these women arrested and I'll have this stranger's head cut off. And then he walks on stage and then, what, grandfather? You're wearing a dappled fawn skin. You're dressed like a Maenad. You've got a Thyrsus. Shake that nonsense off your head. Oh, Tiresias, I knew it was you. I should have suspected it was you behind it. You want a new cult so that you can get money off of people with a new religion because you're a scammer. And then Tiresias dresses him down. He says, you better be careful. You should show honor to the god. And Cadmus points out, yeah, remember your cousin Actaeon, what happened to him on Mount Cithaeron. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, made his own hounds who he raised see him as a stag, and they ripped him to pieces. Either because he bragged that he was a better hunter than her, or another version is he stumbled upon her bathing naked in the woods, and she's a virgin, and she wasn't going to have that. Either way, that's another hugely important symbolic part. The hounds of Actaeon tore King Pentheus's cousin apart. And Actaeon's mother is one of the women who's driven mad out there. And all these things, hounds, these women who go mad, this is all like in book 5 of the Republic that we're going to see. Yeah. So then Pentheus has his soldiers go out and arrest Dionysus, who they think is just some priest of this Dionysian cult. And Dionysus, unresistingly, unafraid, allows himself to be arrested, and he comes back. And then Pentheus interrogates him. Where do you come from? I come from Lydia. Who's this Dionysus? Who's he? He's the son of Zeus. Oh, you have some local Zeus that you made up? No, it's the same Zeus as yours. And they go back and forth, and they're 2 young men, it's said in the description of the play. They're actually cousins, because they're both, the one is Semele is the daughter. They're both daughters of Cadmus.
Okay.
So all these genealogies play in, but they're cousins. They don't know that they're cousins. Dionysus knows they're cousins. And then he says, when do you have your festivals? Oh, we like to do them at night, but the daytime's good. And he goes, oh yeah, I know why you want to do it at night, because you're just trying to pollute these women. And then he says, all right, you like to have your rituals in the dark. Well, I have some of your maenads arrested in the stables under the palace where it's dark. You can go there. And then Dionysus says, don't put manacles on me. When you manacle me, you manacle the god. And he does it anyway, and he locks him up in the stables under the palace. And then Pentheus creates an earthquake. So the temple, the palace comes crumbling down. The Bacchae chorus are terrified. They're worried that Dionysus is hurt. He comes smiling out in the rubble. He goes, oh, were you worried that I was going to leave you? And they're saying, how could we not be worried? And then Pentheus was down there in the stables Dionysus explains, trying to stab him and tie him up, but really it was a bull that he was tying up, and he thought it was Dionysus. So there's all this religious.
This is trippy.
It is trippy. Then he comes out and he goes, what? You escaped? Shall I arrest you again? That's important, because in the beginning of the Republic, Socrates gets arrested. Oh, then a messenger comes and says, sire, you're not going to believe what miraculous things are going on Mount Cithaeron. There were some cow herders there who were grumbling about all these women. They're out there suckling baby wolves, the ones who are mothers, and they're drawing up milk and honey and wine from the ground with their thyrsi, their magic wands. And a group of these cow herders were talking to each other, and then some city slicker said, hey, look, there is Agave, Pentheus's mother. If we capture her, he'll really be happy and he'll give us a reward. What do you say? They say, okay, we'll do it. So they were laying an ambush. And then the maenads came down doing their miraculous cavorting on the hills, and they went to try to grab Agave. And she went insane and berserk, and they started ripping the cows apart. In one tear, they could take a baby calf and rip it apart.
Wow.
They were snatching the children away. They weren't killing the human children, but like kidnapping them and stealing all their stuff. They throw it on their back, and magically it would just stay where it was. And then they went back, and they had blood on their faces, and they had a crown of snakes that would lick off the blood, and there was flames coming out of their heads. Yeah, it was really...
Have you seen this performed?
I've seen bits and pieces on YouTube. Okay. I looked at, and that's why I sent you those images in the email, because I was getting doll-E to... So then the messenger says, okay, so beware, just accept this god to Thebes. Everyone keeps telling him, just accept the god. Clearly, there's a god at play here. And he goes, nonsense, I'll get out my heavily armored soldiers this time, and we will kill all these women. He's going to kill his own mother and aunts and all the women of Thebes, or whoever resists. And then Dionysus says, okay, hold on. Wouldn't you rather just see their naked orgies? He didn't say naked orgies, but wouldn't you rather see them dancing And then all of a sudden he goes, yeah, actually, I would pay a great sum to see that, because Dionysus is driving him mad. And then he says, well, why are you so passionately curious to see? And he goes, well, it would be a shame to see them drunk, but you'd like to see them nevertheless? He goes, oh, yeah. Well, you can't go dressed as a man. They'll see you, they'll tear you apart. So we'll have to dress you up as one of them, as a woman. And he goes, oh, no way, I'll never dress as a woman. This is all important for the Republic in book 5. Because in book 2 and 3, men are not allowed to pretend to be women on the stage. So then Pentheus says, oh, I'll think about it. And he leaves the stage, and then Dionysus speaks to the audience, saying of mine, this man would never dress as a woman, but I've driven him mad. I'll have him walk through Thebes dressed as a woman and made a fool. And then he comes back and he goes, okay, I'll do it. Dress me up. And then so Dionysus dresses him up. He says, here, let me be your maid. He tucks his hair back in his snood, which is some net for the wig he was wearing, and he dresses him up as a Maenad. They walk up to Mount Cithaeron, and then Pentheus says, well, I can't see them. Maybe if I could get on top of this fir tree, I could get a better look. So Dionysus bends the fir tree magically down, puts him on top, which now is like he's a human thyrsus, like a pine cone on top of this pine tree. And then a voice from the sky says, you know, my Maenads, look, a spy, you know, kill the spy. And the women go mad. They go berserk. And they think it's a mountain cub, a mountain lion cub. His own mother, that's what she thinks. But somehow they think that it can still reveal the secrets of their cult. And so they start throwing rocks and sticks at him, but they can't reach him. So eventually, with their bare hands, they rip up this tree. He comes crashing down. He's screaming. He rips off his wig, and he says, "Mother, it's me. Don't you know it's your son? Don't kill me. I was wrong, but I've learned my lesson." But she doesn't see him. She sees a mountain lion cub, and they rip him to pieces, starting with his own mother. Then she marches back to Thebes with his head on her thyrsus.
Wow.
And she's proud, you know, oh, won't my father be proud of me? And won't my son be proud when they see their mother's a great hunter? They need weapons. Well, my women and I, the hounds who hunt with me. She calls the women hounds. So this dog theme, there are a bunch of dogs. Yeah. And the chorus of ancient Bacchae say, fleet hounds of madness, go kill this evil King Pentheus. So she marches back with his head on a thyrsus, and Cadmus, in the meantime, had gathered up the pieces of his body with some servants and brought it back. And he brings her out of her madness. He says, take a quick look. What do you really have? And then she's like, oh my God, it's my son's head. How did I get this? And then Dionysus did it. You shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, you shouldn't have fucked with him.
You should have fucked with Dionysus.
Yeah.
Too justly has he dealt with us, because even though Cadmus was ready to go. Oh, yeah, another really important point I forgot to mention earlier. Cadmus told Pentheus, even if you think this is a lie, that Dionysus was Semele's son, nevertheless, it's a noble one because it brings honor to our family. It would be your cousin is a god. So a noble lie, huge in public.
Oh, right.
And when Plato talks, or has Socrates talk about the noble lie in the Republic, he calls it a Phoenician thing. Cadmus was a Phoenician.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So he's pretty clearly pointing out to Cadmus, telling Pentheus the noble lie of believing Dionysus is a god. All right. So there's
and that has to do with the Platonic noble lie as well, because it's talking about there being essentially like these tiered lineages of like gold, silver, bronze.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I mean, what higher lineage would there be than being related to a god, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. The noble lie is about with autochthonous birth, being born underground.
Yeah.
The Athenians had their own myth of their founders being born underground.
Oh, okay.
As did Thebes and as did Sparta. So why say, oh, it's a Phoenician thing? Why not just talk about your own native Athenian myth? And the implication, I believe, is to point to the Bacchae. Pentheus becomes a scapegoat of the god Dionysus. So that's, in a nutshell, the Bacchae. Now, in the Republic, it begins with Socrates recalling a conversation he had the day before. And it begins with him saying, yesterday I went down to Piraeus with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to worship the goddess.
Yeah, they're going to some festival, right? Like the
Yeah,
festival of the goddess. Yeah.
a festival of the goddess, a Thracian goddess, Bendis, it turns
Yes.
out. We learned from Thrasymachus, this will be your last something at the feast of Bendis. So Bendis is the goddess of the moon, but she's also likened by the Greeks to Artemis, the virginal goddess of the hunt. Artemis is the one who had Actaeon, Pentheus's other cousin. He had Actaeon's own hounds, hunting dogs, rip him to pieces on Mount Cithron, where King Pentheus was ripped to pieces by the Maenads, who called themselves hounds who hunt with me. So there's that parallel. So when he mentions Bendis, who's like Artemis, that's already a kind of a parallel. And like you were saying before, the Republic has a lot of going down and coming up.
Yep.
Well, right there. I went down to Piraeus, which is the port town outside of Athens. And then they see the festival, and then Polemarchus, who's a young man who lives in the Piraeus. And there's an important context. By the time Plato was writing this, Polemarchus had already been killed by the 30 tyrants in that port town of the Piraeus. So after the Peloponnesian War, when Athens lost to Sparta, Sparta inserted a new government, and the leaders were called the 30 tyrants. And the head leader in the Piraeus was Critias, who had formerly been Socrates' student. And some people suspect that Socrates was ultimately put to death by the restored democracy because they thought he had influenced the 30 tyrants who went on a murderous rampage and were killing people. Plato writes about it in letter 7. So Polemarchus had already been killed by some of Socrates' former students in the Piraeus. So that's the historical context that Plato knew about while writing this. And now this, of course, happened, it was placed in a time prior to that.
Right.
So Polemarchus and some young men, including Plato's brother Adimantos, yell out, or no, they send a slave boy to go grab Socrates' cloak. And Socrates is with Glaucon, who's Plato's other brother.
Yeah.
So the slave boy holds Socrates' cloak. He says, Polemarchus orders you to wait. So just wait. And then Polemarchus shows up. And he goes, oh, were you guys thinking of heading back to Athens? And then Socrates says, yeah, not a bad guess. He goes, well, do you see how many of us there are here? So either be stronger than us or you'll have to stay. And then Socrates says, well, what if we do a third thing and I talk you into letting us go? And then Polemarchus says, well, what if we won't listen? And then he says, okay, well, then that'll be how it is. The majority wins. So it's like the force of democracy, because Polemarchus represents democracy, and he sends a slave boy, and there's the whole dynamic. As you were saying, everything is symbolic.
And it sets the stage for discussing justice too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they're down in the Piraeus, it was like down in the cave. And then they go to Polemarchus' house, and Cephalus, his old father, is there. And Socrates says, he looked very old to me. He was sitting on a stool with a cushion. He had an ivy wreath around his head. He had just done sacrifices. And then Cephalus warmly greets Socrates. Socrates, we haven't seen you here in a while. You should come here more often. So that's reminiscent of Cadmus, who's King Pentheus' grandfather, and Tiresias, the blind old prophet. They're described as very old. They have ivy around their head, and they're going to go do the sacrifice of the god, which isn't an animal sacrifice. It's dancing and singing for the god.
Okay.
Now, it's just in the Republic, it's just Cephalus. But I'm saying at the beginning of that, when Polemarchus has Socrates arrested, Polemarchus is playing the role of King Pentheus.
Yeah.
Who sent his soldiers to arrest Dionysus. Polemarchus sends a slave to go arrest Socrates. Then they get down to Piraeus, and one thing to keep in mind is these different characters from the Bacchae, different characters in the Republic will represent those characters from the Bacchae at different times. Like the Thrasymachus will play the role of Pentheus at a certain point. And Socrates, who starts out as Dionysus, kind of starts to play the role of Tiresias, because Cadmus is kind of like Cephalus, the father of Polemarchus, is reminiscent of Cadmus, the grandfather of King Pentheus.
Okay.
When Socrates comes, he warmly greets him, just like Cadmus.
I'm confused. I'm sure a lot of people are confused, but the gist of it is that if you map it out, you can see that it's the same sort of archetypal thing unfolding through different characters at different times in the Republic.
Right, which has philosophical implications, like these archetypes are the underlying subtext.
Mm-hmm.
And different people will be energized by those archetypes. Those archetypes will possess different characters at different times. I think it's part of the lesson. There's this underlying archetype that's invisible, that's orchestrating the surface reading of, you don't even know it's there, just like the archetypes, the absolute ideas. You don't know they're there, but they're creating the whole mirage of the material world.
And for people that don't know, I mean, metaphysically speaking, Platonism has built into it this, not assumption, but this, a superior hypostases to the visible and physical world, and that in that realm there are these perfect forms that kind of exist in the mind of God, if you want to call it that, or just in cosmic consciousness, and then they sort of shine down here and influence everything here in an unseen way, but in a way that you can come to know if you investigate deeply enough.
Yeah. And briefly, I'm going to mention this. We mentioned it before, these absolute ideas. Plato, in the dialogue, the Timaeus, which is a conversation that's held after the day after Socrates recalls the Republic.
Right.
So these absolute ideas are placed specifically out at this outermost sphere, which he calls the mother substance. And furthermore, he equates with ether. And then the other elements, earth, water, fire, and air, are projected inward as if by a winnowing machine, it says in the Timaeus.
Oh, okay.
A winnowing fan for like separating chaff from the wheat. So another name for Dionysus is like Nietzsche. This is the golden bow. With James Fraser, he wrote about this. One of the names for Dionysus is he of the winnowing fan. Because they were also used as cribs for babies. So when Plato has Timaeus describe his outermost mother substance as a winnowing fan, that's as much as to say Dionysus is out there. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche says Dionysus was dismembered into earth, water, fire, and air.
Interesting.
So
they're equating him with the aether.
Yeah. Okay. Yep, that was the outermost sphere in the Timaeus. And the shape was a dodecahedron.
Yes.
But it's a spherical dodecahedron. But the identifying it with a winnowing fan is, I believe, linking it to Dionysus. That's the crib of Dionysus. It's the mother substance, the mother and the son of God. St. Augustine talked about the horizon of the cosmos in a very similar way. That the city of God, it's the mother of God, and God resides there, and so does the Son, the Logos. So at any rate, that Dionysus is the god.
Before I forget this, I want to tell you this to see if you've looked into this at all. There is a physics paper from 2006 or 8. I don't remember which, but essentially arguing that the fundamental structure of reality is a dodecahedron.
Yeah.
And it's not, I don't believe this person is influenced by Platonism at all. Like, there's technical reasons for them saying that. Yeah. I have no idea if this is still a popular idea or an idea being floated. But when I saw that, I was just like, whoa.
Right. The headlines linked it to Plato. That's why I saw it.
Okay.
Also.
Okay.
It was some higher dimensional dodecahedron. I'm not sure, but that would relate to the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, because the dodecahedron is one of these perfectly symmetrical solids. There's 5 of them that Plato mentions in the Timaeus.
Yep.
So they call them the Platonic solids. So coming back to the Republic, Socrates talks to Cephalus, and then he says, "Oh, how is it getting so old? because Cephalus is a worldly man. He doesn't have much he can teach Socrates, but he does know about getting old. Socrates is about 60, I've heard during this conversation. Cephalus is probably in his 80s. And then Socrates says, can you still have sex? And then Cephalus says, oh, no, it's just like I heard Sophocles say once, I've been freed from that tyrannical master. I don't have to do that anymore, but I am afraid now of the afterlife. I used to laugh at stories of Hades, but now that I'm getting close to death, I'm thinking, oh no, maybe it's right. So old age is okay if you have enough money to pay off the debts you owe and to offer sacrifices to the gods to placate them for your sins. And that's what he had just been doing. He had just come from a sacrifice. He still had the crown of ivy on his head, and he was about to leave to go do a sacrifice. And then Socrates says, oh, you're worried about angering the gods. Well, what do you think justice is? And he goes, it's telling the truth and giving what you owe. And then Socrates says, oh, well, what if someone lends you a sword, and then when they go mad, they ask for their sword back? Would it be just then to tell them the truth and give them what they're owed? And then Cephalus says, no, I guess you're right. That wouldn't be just, but I got to go off to the sacrifices. I leave you the argument, Polemarchus, my son, just like I leave you my estate. So then at this point, Polemarchus takes the place of his father, Cephalus. And in my opinion, he therefore, at this point of the play, is taking the role of Cadmus in the Bacchae. Because Polemarchus now, he arrested Socrates, but now he's Socrates' ally. At first, he's like, oh, yeah, it is telling the truth and giving what you're owed. But Socrates talks him out of it and says, sometimes you need to lie. So he's planting the seeds for this whole dialogue.
Yeah.
And then Polemarchus comes around and he becomes Socrates' ally. And then Thrasymachus, the sophist who wants to teach people how to become, use rhetoric to get what you want, leaped at them like a savage beast, Socrates recalls. And he very sarcastically talks about how frightened he was. And he was shaking in his boots because Thrasymachus leaped at them and said, oh, this is all nonsense. Socrates, you tell us what justice is. And he goes, oh, I don't know. And then he says, oh, Heracles, this is the customary irony. You'll never tell anybody what you think. You only tear apart what they say. And then Socrates says, well, I don't know what it is, so you tell me. And he goes, well, then what will you pay me if I do? And he goes, oh, I'll give you some money when I get it, which is never, because he's broke all the time. Right. And then Glaucon says, we'll give you money. So for money's sake, speak. Then Thrasymachus says, very well, justice is the advantage of the stronger. There, I'm done.
Right.
And then what do you mean? And ultimately it comes down to like legal positivism. Whoever is the politically powerful makes the laws of the state. Yeah. The laws are created for the lawmaker to get the lion's share of everything. So justice is the rules made by those who are strong enough to make the law and enforce them. And then Socrates and Polemarchus says, no, that can't be it. It's good to be just. It's not just, to pretend to be just to take advantage of other people. And Socrates and Thrasymachus go back and forth. And in the end, Socrates beats Thrasymachus' argument, and Thrasymachus famously blushes. And then he becomes tamed. So that Thrasymachus attacking Socrates and Polemarchus is in some ways combining King Pentheus attacking Cadmus and Tiresias, the two old men with ivy on their heads, and Thrasymachus interrogating Socrates is like King Pentheus interrogating Dionysus himself. Only it's a bit reversed. Thrasymachus is angry and like Pentheus is, but Thrasymachus is saying injustice is actually good, and all this talk of justice is just for weaklings, whereas Pentheus is saying, no, these women are obscene disorder, and he's actually standing up for the traditional sense, what he believes to be just.
Yeah.
So then Socrates defeats Thrasymachus, but Adimantas and Glaucon, Plato's brothers, take up the charge. And Adimantas says, Socrates, people, they know that you change the argument little by little each time, and each little change slips by, but at the end, add them all up, and you got somebody thinking the exact opposite of what he started thinking.
Yep.
We know these tricks. You're famous for these tricks. You're the best at this wrestling with words. Here's what we want you to do. Prove that justice is good for its own sake, even if people think you're unjust. Take the unjust man and the just man to their infinite extremes and prove to me that justice is good in that case. And here's the example. There's a story of Gyges, the shepherd of the king of Lydia.
Okay.
Dionysus is from Lydia, so this is similar. Dionysus created an earthquake when they locked him in the stables. When King Pentheus locked Dionysus in the stables under the palace, he created an earthquake. Now, in this story, there's an earthquake that opens a chasm in the ground, and the shepherd, Gyges, goes down, and he sees an enormous bronze horse hollowed out. And there's a dead corpse of a giant inside the bronze horse, and he's wearing a ring. And so Gyges takes the ring and he goes back up. So again, down and up, as you say, always in the dialogue, it's going down and back up. He goes back up, and then he realizes when he's wearing the ring and it's pointed a certain way, the other shepherds talk about him as if he wasn't there. And then he realizes it makes him invisible. Now he goes and has sex with the queen. He kills the king with her help, and he becomes the tyrant of the city. And he can do whatever he wants with impunity because he can do it invisibly. And so Adimantas and Glaucon say, now you argue that it's good to be just, even if everyone thinks you're unjust, and it's not good to be a tyrant who's unjust, even if everyone thinks that you're just.
Right. Show
that justice is good, not for any reward you can get from it, but for its own sake.
Yes. For
the health of soul, eudaimonia, that it will give you. Prove that. Then Socrates says, okay, well, I'm not up to this task, but if someone's attacking justice, I feel I got to try my best. And here's a strategy I suggest. The soul is small and hard to see. If there was words that were small and hard to see and you knew somewhere else they were written on a larger scale, wouldn't you go and read them there? Yeah. Well, a city is like a little individual soul expanded because it's made of a bunch of little souls.
Right.
So maybe if we develop our ideal city that's ideally just, we can discover justice in the city, and then we can extrapolate and see if it correlates to the soul. What do you say? Okay, let's do it. All right.
And sidebar here is where we focus in on that point, because most people think that the Republic is literally about a discussion about how to create the ideal city-state, when in the very beginning, we're still in the early, like book 2 here or something.
Yeah.
Like we're still in the beginning of the whole dialogue, and they say that they're using a city as an example that is actually about ordering the soul and having a just soul. So that's what it's in plain text, what it's actually about, more so than it's literally about trying to create a perfect city state. Ordering the soul. Yeah.
It's a hypothesis in order to analyze the individual soul.
Yes.
And he says it might not be accurate. Maybe it won't work, but let's try. So the first ideal city he establishes is this agrarian, vegetarian, simple state where everybody fulfills one job. There's a baker and a farmer and an ironsmith. They have no luxuries. And then the culmination of that city is they have a vegetarian feast with ivy on their heads. They sip wine with their children and feast and sing of the gods, which is very Orphic.
Yeah.
Especially when they put the ivy on their heads and they're drinking wine and singing of the gods. This is Dionysus' specialty. In the Bacchae, the chorus praises him as the god of feasts and banquets and wearing ivy and drinking wine and singing. So it's a Dionysian, Orphic, vegetarian, simple state.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, they wear ivy on their heads and they sing of the gods while drinking wine in moderation, and they don't breed beyond their ability to provide for their children. And then Glaucon says, that's a city fit for pigs. And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, well, where's the relishes? And then Socrates comically says, oh, okay, fine. Well, we'll roast some acorns too. And he adds, we'll have some figs. I mean, we're not going to, we're not Spartans over here. And he goes, no, I'm talking about things like, more luxurious things. Oh, you're talking about couches and courtesans and cakes and things like that. Yeah, very well. I guess we could develop a feverish city too, if you like. That way we can see how injustice comes into being, just like we'll see how justice comes into being. Okay, well, first we'll need to do is cut a canticle of our neighbor's land out. Why? Well, you want to eat meat now, we're going to have to graze our animals, which means we're going to need more land, which means we're going to need an army to take it from our neighbors. And we're going to need doctors because a heavy, rich diet like this is going to make people sick. So now you see the root of sickness and war, eating meat. This is very Orphic. The Orphics and the Pythagoreans were vegetarian, and they believed in reincarnation. You know, before I forget, I think I'm going to get back to the Republic, and they're going to develop the feverish city, which is going to lead to Book 5, where the parallels with the Bacchae really jump out. But from the Phaedo, where Socrates, as the end, drinks the hemlock, they sentenced him to death, in large part because they thought he was guilty of having 30 tyrants kill Polemarchus and others. So I'm just going to read this quote. I'm going to read two versions of it. In the collected, I think most people, I know when I'm such a Plato geek that, I don't know if you have this version?
No, I wish.
Yeah. I'm going to read this translation and then a translation of this other. It was a master's thesis I read, which is really great. He's talking about Plato's Orpheus. I forget the guy's name, but at any rate, here's what Socrates says in the Phaedo. He says, perhaps these people who direct the religious initiations are not so far from the mark, and all the time there has been an allegorical meaning beneath their doctrine that he who enters the next world uninitiated and unenlightened shall lie in the mire, but he who arrives there purified and enlightened shall dwell among the gods. You know how the initiation practitioners say, many bear the emblems, but the devotees are few. Well, in my opinion, these devotees are simply those who have lived the philosophical life in the right way, a company which all through my life I have done my best in every way to join, leaving nothing undone which I could do to attain this end. Here's the other translation. Many are the thyrsus bearers, but the Bacchants are few. That's what he says in the Phaedo. Okay. You know, if you don't get initiated, you lie in the mud rather than go into the afterlife. And then in what Plato wrote is, or here's another translation. He says, here, I'm going to read this other translation. Those who established the mysteries for us were not thoughtless. This is a more exact translation. But in reality, by speaking in ancient riddles, that whosoever arrives in Hades uninitiated and unperfected, he will lie in the filth. But whosoever arriving there after having purified and initiated himself, he will dwell with the gods. For there certainly are, as they say in the mysteries, quote, many thyrsus bearers, but few Bacchae.
Very interesting.
And then Socrates says, all my life I've been trying to join this crew. There's nothing I've left undone.
Throughout, it's not even just the Hellenic world, but it's just this widely held theme that you can somehow be initiated while you're alive in such a way so that you won't die when you die, or you'll have far better circumstances when you die. And then reincarnation comes into this too, which is a whole other complication, but we'll leave it at that there's this long-standing theme that's somehow being initiated into the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, seemingly later on with people like Plotinus, waking up in the sphere of nous or whatever you want to call it. Same thing with Hermeticism. There's that whole thing in the Corpus Hermeticum where he's given the lesson about being reborn into the Logos or the nous. I forget which one he says. But the same idea that you somehow gain this immortality, this spiritual immortality while you're still alive, and you just go into that spiritual immortality.
Yeah, preparing for death. That's what Socrates called philosophy, is preparing to die. And here's a quote from the Republic. He said, when the eye of the soul is really buried in a barbaric bog, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it up above. So that's an Orphic idea that he mentioned in the Phaedo. You're wallowing in the mire. So to go through these ritual initiations opens the eye of the soul, takes it out of the barbaric bog and opens it to the idea of the good, this brilliant archetype of the sun that's the source of all being.
Yeah. And we should say he says dialectic there too. So I think he viewed all of education and philosophy as part of this upward path. And there's an important theme that runs throughout the Platonic dialogues, that things sort of need to happen slowly and step by step. Like you can't just skip things, like, the cliche thing that I've said a billion times on the podcast about how he had let none ignorant of geometry enter here. It's like you can't skip over rudimentary kinds of education. Like those are important for each successive step in this initiation. I say this as someone who's clearly woefully uninitiated in certain things that he would have deemed necessary. So I'm aware of the irony there, but yeah, so it's all part of this grand blooming of the soul that they saw philosophy collectively as this thing that culminated in this almost like spiritual rebirth.
Yeah, Socrates is trying to say that my dialectic process, which is just questions and answers, trying to get down to the archetypes, the absolute ideas, which are imprinted on everyone's soul. He has faith in the ability to questioning and interrogating each other can bring us to the truth, because each of us already contains the absolute truths, which we forgot and need to remember. And memory is a huge part. It's how the myth of ends.
Yeah.
This will be saved, and it can save us if we can remember. You can't remember your past life, but if you could, like from the myth of that would help you realize you're not a body, you're an eternal soul. But so getting back to the Republic and the parallels with the Bacchae, the first ideally just city he creates is a Orphic city where they wear the ivy on their heads, sing of the gods, while drinking wine and feasting vegetarianly with their children.
Well, you know what? At this point, fuck it. I wasn't going to say let's do this, but let's also do a quick overview of what Orphic means, because we haven't actually touched on that. And I feel like we can do it in a fairly tight couple of minutes.
Well, that's
maybe.
I mean, from what I've read, no one knows what exactly Orphic is. There's the Derveni papyrus, which was found on a funeral pyre, which is just like the reminiscent
crazy
of the myth
story.
of because he woke up on his own funeral pyre and he remembered the story.
Yes.
The bone tablet, the gold tablet. I've been reading a lot about it recently. Orpheus, how important is he even in the Orphic religion? Because it's not, there's all kinds of different interpretations. What's your take on what is Orpheus?
I was just going to go from the angle of like who Orpheus is and the general story. But beyond that, we don't know, like to your point, we don't know the specifics of whatever these Orphic initiatory traditions were. However, there was a very popular practice of like a kind of, and I believe Socrates says disparaging things actually about these people. They sort of like travel around with this idea that they can give people absolution very easily, and they give them basically like these like special words, so that when they die, and people were buried with these, I think they're called lamellae, like these gold tablets that basically gave you directions upon death, so that you would choose the correct path. And there's something like you need to basically say to a gatekeeper something along the lines of like, I've traveled a long way and I'm like weary and thirsty. I'm the child of starry sky and rocky earth, and I need water or something.
Bacchus sent me is another thing they tell you to remember.
Yeah. So the idea is like there's a spring that if you drink from that spring, your mind will be wiped and you'll be, basically just deleted and go through the soul recycler. But then there's another way that if you've been initiated and you know the passwords and stuff in the afterlife, you'll become like immortal basically and go to like dwell with the gods or whatever. And seemingly Socrates is railing against that. Well, and this is perfect again, because it's like he's contradicting himself, where he's saying there's like a real way of purity that sounds like Orphism, but then there's also this like popular, like nonsense way that is not the true way. But yeah, I mean, I guess we don't even need to really get to the whole background of Orpheus, but he fits this mythological motif of this like divine level musician who can even seduce the gods with his incredible musicianship. His wife dies tragically right after their marriage. Eurydice is her name. He goes to the underworld to try to get her back. So there's that whole story, but maybe we don't even need to go there. But again, we see this motif of like going up and down, going into the afterlife, coming out of the afterlife. The going up and down thing is a very important motif in all of these stories.
Oh yeah. And you're right to point out that he does ridicule the babble of books by Orpheus. These people go door to door with a babble of books. That's how they translate it. And in the myth of he says, look at Orpheus. He was so upset by the way women treated him, because in the end he was ripped to pieces by women.
By Maenads.
Yeah, by Maenads, that he didn't want to become a human, so he became a swan.
Mm-hmm.
And so this master's thesis by this student, I forget his name, but it's Plato's Orpheus. He talks about that. Why, on the one hand, does Plato have Socrates attack Orpheus and Orphism? And on the other hand, he's talking about, my whole life I've tried to been a Thyrsus-bearing Bacchant.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be adopting the Orphic religion, secretly at least, and sometimes openly. The idea of the barbaric bog, the mire in which the soul, that's an Orphic belief. And so he was, like you were saying, he's ridiculing kind of the perverted, popularized version, but he's embracing the original tradition and incorporating it into his own strategy. He's using it and carrying it on in its newest incarnation. So he's like, Socrates is the new Orpheus. Socrates is the new everything. He's the mythic hero of the future, which he has been. He's the father of Western civilization.
True.
Just as the Homer's Odyssey was kind of the structuring principles up to that point. After that point, it's been Plato's dialogues.
Yeah.
But they, as we read from that quote from Nietzsche, it's like all of the art forms were forced into this one ship and the one captain, Socrates, and it's Plato's dialogues. All right, so getting back to the feverish city, he says, okay, we're going to have to bring in all these luxuries. Now, to compensate for all this feverishness, we're going to create this kind of armed camp of purified philosophers. They won't partake in any of these unnecessary bodily pleasures. They're going to get an extreme education. They're going to become perfect philosopher kings. And so he says, all right, so first we need to educate them. And I'm trying to remember, did the noble lie come before he started banning tragic and comic plays, or after? Well, I'll just tell that the noble lie he says is this. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell them all that they were born underground, that the childhoods they thought they had were dreams, and in fact, they were being formed under the ground by the god with one of four metals in their soul: gold, silver, bronze, or iron. And that metal in their soul determines their ranking on the caste system, with the philosopher king at the top, and then the auxiliary guardians below them, they have silver, and then the craftsmen and the farmers have iron and bronze.
Yep.
So there's four metals. This is very similar to the Hindu caste system.
Right.
And he also brings in the tripartite soul.
Yes.
Which is very similar to the Hindu caste system with the three gunas, the three modes of nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance, sattva guna, raja guna, which means king, and tama guna. So we can get into that. But to educate this guardian class to create justice, he creates this is where it starts to get, in book 5, it gets crazy, but in books 2 and 3 and 4, he says, well, we need to educate them in music and gymnastic. Yeah. And music includes all the books of Homer and the tragic and comic plays. And they say, well, we want to teach them not these old stories about how the gods, how Zeus killed Kronos and they kill each other and they lie and they deceive each other. There was one where he says, even if they were true, we shouldn't tell them to just anybody. They should be held in secret to only the select few, so that as few people as possible can hear them. Right. I think that's a little secret aside saying, I'm telling you things in a secret esoteric way.
Yes. Yeah. Even exactly what I was going to say. Yep.
Yeah. He leaves a lot of clues like that. So he says, all right, so any stories about gods who lie and take on different shapes, they're out of here. So right there, the Bacchae's gone. Because the gods don't lie. The gods tell the truth. Now, humans, they're going to need to lie all the time. And the word for lie is, he says, it's like a medicine, pharmakon.
Oh, really?
Pharmakon. It can mean a medicine or a poison.
Yeah.
And he goes, now, humans will always, will need a great throng of lies to keep this city just. And so the noble lie is the one that we said before. But we're not going to let them hear stories about gods that lie or heroes that lie, like Achilles. We're not going to let them hear about Achilles saying, I'd rather be the slave to a penniless servant man on earth than king of Hades, because that's showing fear of death. They're not going to show fear of death. We're not going to let them play on the stage and all kinds of acting like fools, and they can't act like women. Our soldiers can't act like women, although later he's going to have the men and the women be much more equal, and exercise naked together like dogs. But their first thing he does is start censoring all the poets, which is funny because I'm saying he's patterning it on Plato's Bacchae. So then Adimantas, I believe, asks, so will we allow comedies and tragedies?
Euripides Bacchae. You said Plato's.
Oh yeah, Euripides Bacchae. Yeah. And he says, will we allow comedies and tragedies? And he goes, I don't think so. And anyway, our whole idea of justice is that each person does the one job that they're best for. And even a man who's good at writing tragedies can't write a comedy, he says. Now that contradicts what he says in the Symposium. In the Symposium, it shows Socrates at the end passing a big bowl of wine around between him and Agathon, who had just won first prize for his tragic play, and Aristophanes, the famous comic. And he was trying to get them to admit that one man can write tragedies and comedies. So in the Republic, he's completely saying the exact opposite of what he's saying in the Symposium. Which ends with this Dionysian scene when Alcibiades comes in with the playing of flutes and alcohol, and they're drunk, and everyone's... So that's another ironic wink Plato's giving. The same man can't write tragedies and comedies. The whole Republic, I'm saying, is a tragedy and a comedy because it's patterned on the tragic play, the Bacchae, in a way that inverts the surface meaning, which is comical. Another thing, a lesson he's teaching with all this, I believe, is that the idea of the good is the idea of wholeness through the union of opposites. It's the source of all pairs of opposites. It's the source of man and it's the source of woman. It's the source of justice and injustice. It's the source of comedies and tragedies. And so that's another, he's showing rather than telling, what is the idea of the good? The whole Republic is a literary embodiment of the idea of the good. And it's a literary embodiment of Dionysus. So they get rid of all these, and then a really funny thing he has. I want to read this one thing if I could just find it. He's saying, if maybe if someone could prove to us that these tragedians were worth having, we'd put a crown on their head and cover them in myrrh and praise them as, these great men. But we say, but you can't be in our city. We have to have simpler poetry for our city, but we'll worship them basically as deities. So that's what he's saying he's doing. Plato's kind of like, I should be crowned and have myrrh put on my head, but not in our city right now.
And again, I mean, like the other way that you could take this is, again, zooming out, they say, well, it's really hard to talk about an individual soul, so let's talk about a city. Now, if you think about this with the esoteric, it's not even an esoteric hermeneutic, they're kind of leaving it for you right in the beginning. If you think about an ideal version of yourself, would the ideal version of yourself be reading fiction all the time, be engaging in like these, like distracting itself with these stories designed to like rouse your emotions and, you know, all the things that so many of us today are obsessed with and we just piss time away into.
Right.
Like hypothetically speaking, probably not. Probably if you were trying to make the greatest possible version of yourself, you would not make a lot of space for these mundane things that just entertain you. And again, I say this as someone who wastes tons of time
Yeah.
on things like
Right.
this. So yeah.
So, what was that in your Plato's Cave video? You talked about.
Oh, MILF Manor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to waste your time doing that. So they're trying to construct the ideal stories that will help to educate these ideal soldiers. So they censor all the, Homer and the tragic and comic playwrights. They mention Euripides by name. I believe it's book 10, which is another funny thing. So they've created this education, and then they talk about the tripartite soul, the three parts of the soul. You've got your rational part, you've got your passionate part, which is like the chivalrous part, the spirited part, and then you've got your appetites.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're in harmony, that's how you have justice.
Right.
And that also determines your caste. So now at the end, I'm just going to skip to book 5. At the end of book 4, Socrates says, so now that we've created this education for our elite guardian class, and they won't have any money. They're going to share all things in common, like women and children. So it looks like we're done. Looks like we found justice. And then book 5 begins with Polemarchus leaning over and whispering in Adimantas's ear. He grabs him by the cloak, which is reminiscent of the slave boy grabbing Socrates' cloak at the beginning. And he whispers in his ear, and then all Socrates can hear is, shall we let it go or not? And then Socrates says, what? Who won't you let go? And then Adimantas says, you. And he goes, what? You going to arrest me again? Which is like the Bacchae.
Yeah.
When Dionysus escaped after the earthquake he broke him out of the stables, which we remember there was an earthquake in the Republic with the Ring of Gyges story. So then he says, why are you arresting me? And he goes, what's all this about women and children in common? What do you mean by that? And he goes, oh, I was trying to avoid it. You don't know what a swarm of troubles you've brought in when you ask about that. And he goes, it's better to be guilty of involuntary murder than to misguide people about what is right and good. And then Glaucon laughs. He goes, no one's going to accuse you of involuntary murder, so just be brave and speak. And then Socrates reiterates, okay, then, I guess then I'm free of involuntary murder here. Why 3 times bring up the idea of involuntary murder for what he's going to talk about regarding the communistic sharing of women and children? And I'm saying it because it's paralleling the Bacchae, and this is when Dionysus is leading Pentheus out to his death.
Yeah. And just if people are like, wait, what are you saying? So one of the parts of the Republic that, again, when you take it really literally, that people find super objectionable is this idea that there's basically no family structure. Like women and children are just taken by the state, and then they're like shuffled and decided upon. They're educated and broken into the caste system in this hypothetical system that we're talking about, which I just think it's so obvious. It's like not meant to be taken literally, even at this point. But anyway, yeah.
So he says, okay, now I'll talk about it. There's going to be 3 great waves of laughter that might drown us unless some dolphin comes to rescue us. That was an allusion to another mythical story. I looked it up. Adrastia, I forget, but it was the person who founded the dithyramb.
Oh, I don't know
which is the song for Dionysus.
Okay.
He rode in on a dolphin.
Okay.
And Socrates says, we're going to have to go in, once we're in, 6 feet of water is the same as an ocean. we're going to have to swim unless some dolphin comes to our rescue. So, but at any rate, the three waves of laughter, he says, are the first one is that the men and the women will be equal. And he bases that on the idea that Glaucon has hunting dogs. Glaucon is brave in all things. He's like the spirited part of the soul. And Socrates says, you've got hunting dogs. Do you not use the females for the hunt? Do they only rear the pups? He's like, no, they come out on the hunt. They're not as fast and as strong as the males, but they're competent hunters. And he goes, yeah, well, similarly, our guardian class women will be soldiers like the men. Okay. And they'll exercise naked with the men too. They'll strip down naked and they're going to exercise naked with the men. And he's comparing them to dogs. Now, in the Bacchae, the Maenads were constantly called dogs, hounds who hunt with me. Pentheus thought they were naked having orgies out on Mount Cithaeron. And that's an incestuous thought. He wanted to see it. That's his own mother and aunts. And so in returning to book 5, because the second wave...
I just wanted to like throw this in there too. I think the idea of nakedness was probably a lot less taboo just generally. Like like just stripping down naked to exercise was probably like not super abnormal.
Well, so they mentioned it in the Republic. They're like, remember that the Greeks used to laugh at the Athenians for doing that. Now they're used to it.
Okay.
But men and women together, they didn't have. So we'll overcome that too. The second wave of laughter, and I've heard other scholars compare these three waves of laughter to the three waves that were trying to sink Odysseus when he was on his raft. But
and this is another three. This is another tripartite thing yet again in a sea of other tripartite things.
Threes come up all the time.
Yeah.
The 3 and the 4, which is the axiom of Maria. I don't know if you know the axiom of Maria.
I don't.
Carl Jung talked about it. The axiom of Maria is from the 1 comes the 2, from the 2 comes the 3, from the 3 comes the 4 as the 1.
Oh, cool.
We see it. That's how the Timaeus begins. 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
where's
right.
the 4th from yesterday?
Yeah.
And there's 4 virtues. There's wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And justice seemingly comes when the other 3 are appropriately organized.
Right. Yeah. And again, the tripartite soul that gives birth to the 4th, which is dikaios, like the ordering the eros, thumos, and logos gives rise to the 4th. Yeah.
Yeah. And so back to book 5, the second great wave of laughter is that the women and children will be held in common. So no one will have one wife, and no one will know whose children are whose. So first of all, the noble lie says you're born underground. You don't know who your mother and father is. And they try to avoid incest by saying if someone's born within 10 months of each other, but they admit sometimes it'll happen. So they're admitting incest will happen occasionally.
Yikes.
Yeah, right. So, and they'll work it out and they'll use these lies to say, oh, it's a lottery. It's just luck of the draw. You get to mate with this person. But really the upper class of the guardians will be mating the best with the best, like the best dogs with the best dogs. And anyone who has, who they say has lower tendencies, even if they're born to the golden parents, they'll be cast down into the iron and bronze out of the guardian class. The rest of the city, they live like normal people. They have luxuries, they have money, they have families. It's the guardian class alone that is this communistic Spartan society. And then, so that incest, the nakedness of these dog-like men and women having incest, this is what is reminiscent of what King Pentheus thought was going on Mount Cithaeron, that he wanted to go spy on and see. And then Socrates says to Glaucon, well, remember we said that justice in part is each person doing the one job that they're suited to do. But now we're saying men and women should both be acting like soldiers. What do you say, Glaucon? Should we speak on behalf of women? Because we finished the male drama. Now we need to work on the female drama. That's what he says. I think that's an allusion to the Bacchae, which is the drama named after the female devotees of Dionysus. It's probably also an allusion to Aristophanes' play, The Assembly Women, where they also talk about communistic sex and and exercising naked together and old.
Okay.
But the primary subtext I'm saying is the Bacchae. Then the third wave of laughter is that until philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, there'll be no peace. Now, for some reason, that's more comical than naked men and women having communistic, incestuous sex. When the philosophers become kings, and then that leads to book 6 and 7 in the cave allegory. How do you educate a philosopher king?
Mm-hmm.
So in the Bacchae, Dionysus has Pentheus dress up as a woman. So Socrates has Glaucon. Let's imagine the female drama ourselves. Let's talk on their behalf. Oh, Socrates and Glaucon, says Socrates, as a woman. Remember you said men and women, or everyone should do their own part? How foolish it is of you to have us women acting like men. And then that's it. But for that brief interlude, Socrates had him and Glaucon acting like women, which is something that was prohibited.
Oh, right.
Back in book 2, we will not act like women. Specifically stated that. Now he's saying, let's act like women, and they say their role. It's just that one little bit, it's correlating with the Bacchae.
Yeah.
When Dionysus and Pentheus are acting like women.
Yeah.
And then Dionysus tells Pentheus, you're going to go to great fame, towering to heaven. And he puts him up on the pine tree, and then he gets ripped down. Well, in the Republic, towering to heaven is becoming the philosopher king, coming out of the cave and ascending the vision of the divided line until you open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, the brilliant sun. It's towering to heaven. Now you're the philosopher king, overlooking this city that's ruled by soldiers who are the men and the women exercise naked together and have incestuous sex. How wonderful. He's setting him up. And then in books 8, it talks about how the best regime degenerates through 4 lesser regimes, phase by phase, through timocracy ruled by the warriors, which is the spirited part, was it thumos? Then to oligarchy ruled by the wealthy. Then it degenerates into democracy from there. And then from democracy comes tyranny. Because democracy allows you to enjoy whatever you want, but eventually people become slaves to their addictions.
Yeah.
And that's what a tyrant is. It's a total slave to his eros.
Right.
And so the ideal city gets ripped to shreds ultimately into a tyranny. And then in book 9, they go back to talking about getting rid of the poets, especially Euripides. And then in book 10, there's the myth of Ur. But the real conclusion of the Republic is the murder of Polemarchus in the Piraeus, where they were talking, by the 30 tyrants, whom Socrates was suspected of influencing, and then he was subsequently executed, people assume. Ultimately, he was sentenced to death for believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods of the state and corrupting the youth.
Yeah.
Because there was an amnesty. When the 30 left, no charges could be brought against them. So people think they trumped up those other charges. They were really trying to get him for that. So the parallel with the Bacchae is completed. In the Bacchae, in the end, Pentheus is ripped up and killed by the Maenads. And I'm saying the historical fact of some of Socrates' students ripping or killing Polemarchus is the historical fact that serves as the conclusion to the fictional Republic.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so there's the basic parallels.
That's really interesting. I do want to start getting into, this has been a long, winding journey through these parallels. But then the immediate question that it implies is like, what is the larger truth then that both of these archetypal stories are really trying to communicate? Like what are these esoteric secrets underneath the surface of both of these stories? What do you think they're really trying to tell us under different narrative masks?
Right. Well, that's when I wanted to bring in The Birth of Tragedy. By the second greatest philosopher of the Western tradition, in my opinion, Friedrich Nietzsche. He talks about specifically how tragedy, I don't know how deeply we want to get into this. He talks about the Dionysian and the Apollonian forces of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And he relates that to Schopenhauer. And he correlates tragic culture to Indian Brahmanic culture. So what I'm going to do to just kind of explain what I think Plato was trying to do is draw a parallel with the Indian Brahmanic culture. Dionysus says, I came through Bactria. In Bactria, they worshipped Greek and Hindu gods. After Alexander conquered that area, it was already doing that before him because Euripides is before Alexander the Great. But they equated, for example, Heracles with Krishna and Dionysus with Shiva. That's what the Greek historian Megasthenes was doing. But I think whether there was a direct correlation or not, I think it's just helpful to look at the Brahmins, especially the Vishnu worshipping Vaishnava school, and the idea of bhakti, which is devotional service. So in the Bhagavad Gita, that's Krishna speaking to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Arjuna doesn't want to fight a war because it's a civil war, as he's got relatives on both sides. And Krishna explains, here's why it's your duty as a warrior.
Yeah.
And he goes, everything's made of these three modes of nature. Sattva guna, raja guna, tama guna. Goodness, passion, and ignorance. Depending on the combination of those three will determine your caste. Mostly sattva guna or goodness, Brahmin. Mostly raja mixed with goodness, kshatriya, king, a knight. Mostly raja mixed with ignorance, businessman, Vaishya. And those three castes are called twice born. They get initiated. And then mostly ignorance, then Shudra, laborer. And that's your caste. You should do your duty according to your caste, but ultimately you should abandon all religion and just surrender unto me. That's bhakti, devotional, loving service. And then the other side of Krishna is the flute-playing cowherd boy from the village of Vrindavan. And he plays the flute, and the gopis, the cowherd women, come running out of their houses. They drop their babies, they put them down. If they're cooking a meal, if they're old enough to have a family, they drop everything. All the women come running out to the forest to dance with Krishna, which is like the Maenads of Thebes. They all were rushed from the shuttle in the loom, old and young, all of the women out there. And then they're singing for the god and dancing for the god. And in the Hindu tradition, congregational singing and dancing, it's called Sankirtan. One way to open the eye of your soul and remember God is through studying philosophy. Another way, bhakti yoga, is through just an attitude of loving, surrendered service to God, and especially congregational dancing and singing the names of the God.
And this is starting to bring to mind too, like some of the stuff about theomania, like the different states of mania that Socrates talks about too.
Oh yeah. Oh, I had a couple. I don't want to keep getting down the quotes, but in the Phaedrus, he's like, madness sent from the gods is the highest. It beats all hollow the poetry of a sane man, he says.
Right.
This divine madness is the goal in the Hindu tradition, to go insane with love of God. And you lose your concern. You can't even see the material world anymore. And similarly, I believe the Bacchae, especially the Asian Bacchae, the chorus, talks about the service of the God is hard but sweet. We love and we worship the God, and they adore the God, and they sing of the God. And blessed are those who belong to the holy body of God, because God is everybody. So in the Republic, justice is had by unity, by uniting. And the way they have justice in the ideal city is, you're all born under the ground, so the city is your mother. You're all children of the same mother. Well, similarly, if you think you're all parts of the God, then all souls are part of one supreme soul. And if you love the God, you'll automatically love everyone else, because you'll see them as parts of the God. So I think what Plato's doing is, on the surface, he's giving a philosophical explanation of what the idea of the good is the source of all being, and how the eternal forms are reflected here in the material forms imperfectly, and how you can get out of this cycle of reincarnation from this imperfect world, as discussed in the myth of Ur, where they have the three fates, and ultimately the threads of destiny, and bringing that back to string theory out at the horizon of the cosmos, where your fate is determined. And in the Bacchae, if you combine the Bacchae subtext of the Republic with the surface reading, then I think you get what you have with the Hindu worship of the Vaishnava branch of Hinduism, the Vishnu worshiping, especially with Krishna. You've got this warrior philosophy of the three parts of the soul. For them, it's the subtle material body. The soul doesn't have parts, but the subtle body is, and these three modes, according to that tradition, originate at the false ego outermost horizon of the cosmos. Earth, water, fire, air, ether. Then they have three super etheric concentric spheres, which is mind, intelligence, and false ego. False ego is the outermost sphere of the universe. The three modes of nature originate there and then create everything within. Man. So it's this worshiping God through a loving devotional service, singing and dancing for the God, and studying rationally, philosophically, what is God combined together is the 1-2 punch. And like you were saying, if you didn't study geometry, you're not welcome here. I studied geometry, up to 10th grade.
Right.
I know what the square root of -1 is. It's philosophically fascinating. I can't use it mathematically.
Right.
But I think even if you don't have any geometry, one version or the other will work if you use it, take it all the way. A simple, illiterate farmer who sings lovingly for God, I think, can open up the eye of the soul to God. Once you open your eye of the soul and see the supreme source of being, it doesn't matter how you got there. Maybe you can get there through intense mathematical analysis of the world. I'm going to bring.
Let me posit a question then.
Okay.
Why go through the effort of educating yourself? Why go the path of the philosopher when you can just go the simple devotional path? Like why do you think particularly people like Plato and Socrates seem to, and really I think the whole Western esoteric tradition stresses the importance of initiations and effort? Why do you think that is?
I think it's because of doubts. The more intelligent you are, the more you're going to doubt the stories of the gods.
True.
If you're a simple-minded person, and in the Bacchae, the Asian chorus of Bacchae say, what the simple man believes and does, we too believe and do. All these subtleties of these thinkers don't affect us at all. But they do affect, it seems the more powerful your intellect is, the less likely you will be to believe the stories of the God.
Yeah.
So to assuage that kind of intellect, you have to, all right, well, then let's analyze intellectually the foundations of nature. Nietzsche talks about that. That's what Socrates did. But he says, when you take science to its extreme, it curls back on itself. The periphery of science has an infinite number of points, he says. And when science reaches its end, it's like the snake that bites its own tail. It's looking into impenetrable darkness. It realizes science is never going to tell us the ground of being. And at that point, it comes full circle back to where it started, which is this resignation and this need for myth. So when you take the intellect to its extreme, you come to the limits of the intellect. And he specifically talks about this outermost sphere. I think that's important because in the physics community today, the extreme of physics is the singularity.
Yeah.
All the mathematical equations keep pointing to this point of infinite density, which contains all space and time.
Yeah.
And it throws all predictive power out the window, and a lot of physicists like Michio Kaku hate it. They hate it because, as Stephen Hawking pointed out, Pope Pius XII said, singularity, that's God. And then a lot of the physicists were like, yep, sure sounds like that. Therefore, it shows that Einstein's theory is flawed. His theory of gravity must be flawed because there is no such thing as a singularity, because there's no such thing as God. But I'm saying we've reached, thanks to Socrates as initiating this scientific revolution, we've come to the end of this mathematical quest. It brought us back to the Platonic cosmology of the soul of the universe being this infinitely dense point in the center, which somehow occupies each point of the encompassing sphere, where the past, present, and future are conserved. They radiate in on these strings of energy to create this holographic illusion. Brian Greene, the famous string theorist, explicitly compared this to Plato's cave allegory.
Oh, wow.
He said it's like Plato's cave turned inside out, because in the cave, the shadows are a two-dimensional wall, and they're projected from three-dimensional objects. But in Plato's idea, the three-dimensional objects are shadows of the eternal forms. But I'm saying it doesn't turn it inside out, because the horizon of the cosmos, from our perspective, is perfectly flat. But if you have a near-death experience like Carl Jung had, you go out there and you experience all these archetypes. In 1944, Carl Jung had a heart attack. Mm-hmm. Then he had an out-of-body experience where he rose above his body, above the hospital. He saw the curvature of the earth. And when he got back, he said, it seems to me as if each of us lives in our own little box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, and that the past, the present, and the future are all out there. And that's where he witnessed, for example, the sacred marriage of Hera and Zeus and all these archetypal scenarios.
Yeah.
So science pushes us back to the origins of mythology, says Friedrich Nietzsche. And that's
and man, we haven't even brought up this yet, but have you by chance seen my most recent video?
The one you just did about Newton and Descartes?
Well, it starts with that, but that's just kind of the introduction. And I spend more of the video actually talking about these iatromantes, and then part of the Phaedo, where I won't even get into this now, but then eventually Parmenides. And Parmenides, that, and the snake eats its own tail again here, in sort of, instead of at like an ending point, at a beginning point, because Parmenides is typically thought of as the father of logic, but he got the logic download from a vision of the goddess.
Oh, okay.
So On Nature by Parmenides is him doing what sounds basically like soul travel or astral travel through the gates of justice, by the way, to encounter this mysterious goddess of night, who tells him basically there's two paths to knowledge. One path of knowledge is the truth.
Right.
The truth is united and whole. It was never created. Therefore, nothingness is absurd. There never has been nothing. There never will be nothing. There never will be anything except the whole.
Right.
So she's like telling him the truth of reality is this monistic unity.
Yeah.
But then there's the like the path of mortals, the path of doxa, path of opinion, of diversity, of the way things seem, of the senses. That's an illusion.
Like the divided line.
Yeah, but you still have to learn that way and understand that way, and why humans are obsessed with discussing the world in extremes: hot, cold, love, hate, birth, death. And you also have to be able to see through that if you want real knowledge. So it's like it's been here like all along. I mean, that this is pre-Socratic stuff, right? And then there's the iatromantes, these healer seers who inspired Parmenides, who were basically like these yogis or shamans who were wandering around doing all kinds of different wonder-working feats and soul traveling. And then there's all these really interesting, speaking of gods, there's all this interesting subtext, because there's every single one of them seemingly has a direct connection to Apollo.
Right.
So it's, I mean, we haven't even brought this up. You got to check out this video, and then I feel like we can have a whole other conversation.
Right.
But anyway,
I want to read one thing from section 15 of the Birth of Tragedy, which was originally the last section, and then he added others onto it. here, I'm just going to read a little bit. He said, anyone who has personally experienced the pleasure of Socratic knowledge and feels how it seeks through ever widening circles to encompass the whole world of phenomena. So he keeps talking about this outermost sphere. He knew what Plato was saying. That's where the absolute ideas are. To seeks through ever widening circles to encompass the whole world of phenomena, which is the material, changing temporal world, will feel no more intense spur to existence than the desire to complete the conquest and to draw the net impenetrably tight. To someone so disposed, the Platonic Socrates then appears as the teacher of a completely new form of Greek serenity and blissful existence, which seeks to discharge itself in actions and will find this discharge mostly in meutic, that's birth-giving, like midwifery, and educational influences on noble youths for the purpose of the final production of genius. But now science, spurred on by its powerful delusion, hurtles inexorably towards its limits, where the optimism hidden in the essence of logic founders. For the periphery of the circle of science has an infinite number of points, and while there is no telling yet how the circle could ever be fully surveyed, the noble and gifted man, before he has reached the middle of his life, still inevitably encounters such peripheral limit points and finds himself staring into impenetrable darkness. Like I said, the black hole in the horizon of the cosmos. If he at that moment sees to his horror how in these limits logic coils around itself and finally bites its tail, then the new form of knowledge breaks through, tragic knowledge, which in order to be tolerated needs art as a protection and a remedy. And he says, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He says, at this point we knock with sturdy motions at the gates of the present and the future. Will this transformation lead to ever new configurations of genius and precisely of Socrates as maker of music? Will the net of art, which is cast over existence, whether under the name of religion or science, be woven ever more tightly and delicately, or will it be torn apart? But he's saying the effect of Socrates and the meaning, the intention, the goal of the Socratic was to bring us full circle, to force us to face the horror of the impenetrable, infinite depths of being. And only then, only a horizon of mythology can complete a cultural movement.
Wow.
So Socrates was the anti-Dionysian force, but the ultimate purpose was to bring society full circle back to a rebirth of tragedy and a union of Socratic philosophy and tragic mythology inspired by specifically the music. And that he called that the Socrates who practices music. And I'm saying, I think Nietzsche saw the parallel between the Bacchae and the Republic, but he didn't spill the beans. Instead, he alluded to it with his own riddles because he had plans of his own. But I believe that's where we are in society now. If the Republic is secretly patterned on the Bacchae.
Wow. So, and then this gets into eventually why he starts calling himself Dionysus, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Because most people think that that's him going crazy due to syphilis or whatever, but he's already, I mean, with what you're outlining here, there's like a very logical path toward that. If he's seeing this like Apollonic thread as one extreme and then this Dionysiac thread as another extreme, and he's choosing to associate himself with that kind of archetype, you know, there is a direct path there, albeit an extremely esoteric one that takes like a lot of contextualization.
It's a whole nother story. But my theory for Nietzsche is his first book is theistic. It's openly theistic. And it's got allusions to these parallels between Indian and Greek culture. In his day, the Krishna, Buddha, Christ theory was very popular.
Okay. And what was his first book?
The Birth of Tragedy.
Okay.
Out of the Spirit of Music. He's theist. He was born and raised the son of a Lutheran pastor who died before he turned 5, but he was expected to be a Lutheran pastor. He was very pious as a child, all the way up till he was 17. Then he got to college and he became an atheist. But then when he's 27...
Jordan Peterson was right.
Yeah, so, well...
They turn you into atheists.
Yeah, well,
the college will turn you into an atheist communist.
That's a good one. It sounded a little bit like Kermit the Frog, too.
Well, he does sound like
But then I'm saying he discovered Schopenhauer, so that brought him to the Vedanta philosophy. And then I believe he heard this popular theory about the relationship between Krishna, Buddha, and Christ. And I think he kind of came back to theism, but he wore the mask of an atheist. Here's one thing he said: I could be the Buddha of Europe. Hindus worship Buddha as Vishnu disguised as an atheist.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if a lot of people know that, but he's one of the 10. Buddha, for Hindus, is one of the 10 primary avatars of God himself, preaching atheism to an atheistic age to give them some peaceful semblance of a cosmology. That's obviously a whole nother ball of yarn, but
dude, this one is really mind blowing, and I'm gonna have to like wrap my mind around this for quite some time. Yeah. But it is making sense though. Like it is touching on territory that I think I could legitimately like drive myself crazy on like some of like probably the last like 15 minutes of this conversation. like this conversation about how like the limits of intellect, of dianoia, lead you back to this mythological, archetypal, chaotic even territory. And it's almost synchronistic, man, that I happened to bring up the Parmenides story about going, because even he said something about going to knock on the gates of what was it? In that quote that you read, he said, knock on the gates of something. Because that's reminiscent of justice guarding the gates of night and day in the Parmenides tale, to see the goddess of night, who is, I mean, she is also associated with a kind of like primordial chaoticness, right?
He says, at this point, we knock with sturdy motions at the gates of the present and the future. So will this transformation lead to ever new configurations of genius and precisely of Socrates as maker of music? So this net of art, which is covering this periphery, which has an infinite number of points and is an impenetrable darkness.
Yeah, and that could be Night herself. That could be like the goddess that Parmenides is encountering.
Yeah, well, that's what Jung called the collective unconscious mind. It's this mind of God, according to St. Augustine. It's where all the absolute ideas in God's creative mind exist, this horizon of the cosmos. The physicists say it's infinitely dark because space-time is expanding at the speed of light there. And past there, it goes faster than light. So no light can get back in past it at all. And yet it's infinitely bright.
Yeah.
Because as space-time is speeding up as it approaches it, it creates infinite heat. So it can't be seen directly. It's infinitely dark, but it creates infinite light. So it's this union of all opposites. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could interpret that. But I think the Socratic method gave us this holographic string theory, which describes the horizon of the cosmos as the source of the absolute ideas, which project on these elastic threads this illusory world.
And if you're not sure what he's talking about here, everyone, you got to check out our first two conversations and also his book, because this is where he kind of outlines the marriage of Jung's mythopoetic vision with theoretical physics. So if you're just like, what? You got to go back and
right. Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. That was my book. I did my dissertation on that and then made it into a book. So I think historically, Socrates' method led to that. It's the union of general relativity and quantum physics in this inside-out black hole model of the universe. Now, if the Republic really is patterned on the Bacchae, if what I'm saying is true, and I think the evidence is pretty strong, that at least it's one element of what Plato was doing, then my question is, why now? Nietzsche said we're knocking at the gates of the present and the future. What is the implication for where we are in history now? If the past, present, and future are already pre-recorded, what phase of the drama of God's mind have we entered now that this parallel between the Republic and the Bacchae that's 2,400 years old has come to light? Since the Republic is the DNA of the Western mind, to discover another strand of DNA interwoven with it would seem to transform society in a way that I think Nietzsche maps out in this book and other books.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, I think we gotta close this one up here. I think
I was hoping you would say that, because I'm like, if we start to get into that, we're gonna be here.
My brain is already like shitting itself from this one. So, but I'm happy to pick this up again. I'm also curious with the admixture of the one I just put out, like what synchronicities will crop up for you, or what threads or tendrils that will evoke of interest for you. But as always, man, this has been mind blowing, and thanks for doing it. Everybody, go grab his book. And yeah, any final thoughts?
Oh yeah, well, let me give a plug to the YouTube class that I created with my friend Beto Paredes, Immortality and the Unreality of Death, A Hero's Journey Through Philosophy, Psychology, and Physics. You can see that. Psycheandsingularity.com is my website. It's on my YouTube channel. It's just like 23 hours free YouTube video series about this whole string theory and the hero's journey and things like that.
Beautiful, man. Thanks for doing it.
Sure. Thanks, Michael.